August 21st, 1942, Guadalcanal. The night air was heavy with the scent of wet jungle and gun oil. Crickets had fallen silent. Somewhere beyond the dark ridge, the sea murmured faintly, a calm that mocked what was coming. American Marines lay flat in their foxholes, their fingers steady on the spade grips of Browning M1917 machine guns. The water-cooled barrels steamed faintly in the humidity. Hoses coiled like serpents. Belts of .30 caliber rounds glinted in the moonlight. Endless, coiled chains of fire, waiting to wake. Then came the sound. Faint at first, then swelling. The haunting chant of men shouting, "Banzai!" Through the trees, hundreds of Japanese infantry surged from the darkness, rifles fixed with bayonets, their courage unshakable. The Marines waited. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, the night erupted. The Brownings thundered without pause. A continuous metallic scream tore across the ridge, minute after minute, belt after belt. The Japanese formations stumbled, stunned by a sound no training had prepared them for. They had expected bursts. Instead, the guns never stopped. By mid-1942, the tide of the Pacific War had begun to turn. The Japanese Empire, after months of unbroken triumph across Asia and the Pacific, had finally been checked at the Battle of Midway. 4 of its aircraft carriers, the pride of its fleet, lay at the bottom of the sea. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan was no longer advancing. But on the ground, the Imperial Army still believed it held the advantage. Its infantry doctrine, built on endurance, speed, and the spirit of the offensive, had crushed Western garrisons across the Pacific. In Malaya, in the Philippines, in Burma, Japanese troops had proven that disciplined, fast-moving men could overrun even fortified positions before defenders could properly react. That confidence followed them to the Solomon Islands. When the U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Japan dismissed it as a minor intrusion. The island's unfinished airfield, later known as Henderson Field, was barely operational. Yet its location threatened Japan's critical supply lanes to the south. The Imperial Army resolved to throw the invaders back into the sea. Quickly, decisively, and with the same aggression that had won them half the Pacific. The men chosen for that task came from the elite Ichiki detachment, commanded by Colonel Ichiki, a decorated officer who had fought in China and was fiercely loyal to the Bushido Code. Ichiki believed deeply in the superiority of morale over machinery. His troops were light, fast, and fanatically disciplined. They carried little heavy equipment, mostly rifles, grenades, bayonets, and a few light machine guns. The belief was simple. The will to win was stronger than steel. Facing them were the U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division, veterans of months of brutal training and commanded by Major General Alexander Vandegrift. Their mission was to defend Henderson Field at all costs, and they were equipped to do so. Among their most vital assets were the Browning M1917A1 water-cooled machine guns, heavy weapons that could fire for hours without overheating. The Japanese, accustomed to short bursts from light Type 96 or Type 99 machine guns, had rarely encountered sustained fire on such a scale. Their doctrine emphasized the rifleman, not the gunner. In theory, this gave them speed. In practice, on Guadalcanal's humid killing fields, it would prove fatal. The first signs came at Alligator Creek, near the mouth of the Ilu River. As night fell on August 21st, Ichiki's men advanced silently through the dense undergrowth, unaware that the Marines were waiting in carefully dug positions. Fields of fire had been mapped, barbed wire coiled invisibly in the dark. Every gunner knew his range and sector. Ichiki's attack was built on the expectation that American defenses, once startled, would crumble, that the enemy's gunfire would falter under the fury of a Japanese charge. It had worked before. At Shanghai, at Singapore, and on the Bataan Peninsula, Japanese infantry had broken through with sheer audacity. But Guadalcanal was different. Here, logistics and machinery would decide the night. The Marines had spent days preparing ammunition belts, hundreds of them, each containing 250 rounds of 30 caliber cartridges. Dozens of water cans stood beside every gun, hoses feeding the Browning's water jacket to prevent overheating. Even as the air grew heavy with humidity and smoke, the Brownings could fire indefinitely. At 0130 hours, when the Japanese line finally erupted from the jungle, the Marines opened up with everything they had. The Japanese expected the guns to falter after a few minutes, but they did not. Belt after belt was fed in. Gunners swapped barrels only when absolutely necessary. Each gun was manned by a crew that had rehearsed the rhythm of sustained fire like a machine. The night was transformed into a storm of continuous sound, not individual shots, but a rolling mechanical roar that crushed the assault. For the first time, Japanese infantry realized that courage alone could not outrun a weapon that did not pause to breathe. And the shock that began on that riverbank would ripple across every island that followed. Turntee, shock that tore through the Japanese ranks at Guadalcanal, did not come from the mere sight of gunfire. It came from its persistence, from the realization that the enemy's weapons could sustain fire far beyond anything they had trained to face. To understand that moment, one must first understand the weapon itself. The Browning M1917A1 was an evolution of a design born in the First World War, a time when warfare had been dominated by trenches, attrition, and the need to keep barrels cool during hours of continuous combat. Its thick, water-filled jacket surrounded the barrel, and a flexible hose connected to a water can beside the gun. As steam hissed out, the condensed vapor was collected, cooled, and fed back into the system. The result was a machine that could fire almost indefinitely, hundreds of rounds per minute, for hours without failure. The gun's stability and the sheer reliability of its mechanism made it the backbone of Allied defensive firepower. By contrast, the Japanese Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, excellent weapons for mobility, were air-cooled and prone to overheating during sustained bursts. They were meant to support the infantry's advance, not to anchor a defensive wall. When fired too long, barrels warped. Gunners were trained to fire in short, deliberate bursts, conserving ammunition and protecting their equipment. This contrast reflected two different philosophies of war. Japanese military doctrine, deeply influenced by the spirit of Bushido, saw warfare as a test of human endurance and will. The soldier was the weapon. Machinery was secondary. Success came from initiative, surprise, and moral superiority. Heavy firepower was often viewed as a crutch, something that dulled courage. American doctrine, however, was pragmatic and industrial. War was not a duel of spirits. It was an equation of fire, steel, and supply. The U.S. military's immense logistical capacity, the ability to deliver endless streams of ammunition, spare parts, and fuel, turned its weapons into instruments of relentless pressure. By 1942, the Marines on Guadalcanal were supplied by naval convoys bringing crates of belted ammunition to the island's beachheads. Every defensive line was built around interlocking fields of fire, where multiple machine guns overlapped their coverage to ensure that no attacker could slip through the gaps. Behind each gun, teams worked like clockwork. One firing, one feeding, one replacing belts, and another keeping water levels stable. It was not just a weapon system. It was a process, a mechanical rhythm of death that could operate through the night. To Japanese infantrymen trained in aggression and mobility, this kind of warfare was alien. Their field manuals emphasized decisive attack, to close with the enemy swiftly, to rely on the shock of bayonets and grenades. Ammunition was carried in limited quantities. Machine guns, though respected, were never given the central role they held in American units. This imbalance became brutally apparent at Alligator Creek. When Ichiki's assault faltered under the continuous roar of Browning fire, runners were sent to find openings, to probe for weak points. But everywhere they turned, another gun opened up. The Marines had arranged their weapons in overlapping arcs, each position able to reinforce the next. The sound was maddening, a constant, unbroken metallic thunder that drowned out orders and prayers alike. Those who survived later recalled that the fire never stopped. Even as the first waves were cut down, the next were met with the same merciless continuity. To the Japanese soldiers who had been told that the Americans lacked resolve, it was disorienting. The machine guns did not falter. They did not tire. By dawn, the truth had set in. Japanese soldiers realized they were facing an enemy who could sustain combat longer than human endurance could last. In later months, during the battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, similar scenes would unfold, endless belts of ammunition feeding the Brownings and M1919s, mowing down charges that had once seemed unstoppable. Each time, the psychological gap widened. The machine gun was not just a weapon anymore. It was a symbol of an industrial empire that fought with logistics, not spirit. And yet, for all its power, it was still operated by men. Marines who sweated in their pits, whose arms trembled from recoil, who fought exhaustion to keep feeding the belts through. Their endurance, mechanical and human, became inseparable. By the end of 1942, the myth of the invincible Japanese charge had begun to break. What replaced it was a grim new understanding on both sides, that modern war belonged not to courage alone, but to those who could sustain fire the longest. The jungle's silence after that first night on Guadalcanal was deceptive, for in that silence, both armies were recalculating what strength truly meant. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, courage was not in short supply. The Japanese infantryman of 1942 was among the most disciplined soldiers of the war. Recruited under a strict code of obedience, he was taught that death in battle was not a tragedy. It was honor. Many came from rural families, men who had labored in fields, hardened by poverty, hunger, and national pride. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors hung over every barracks. Duty is heavier than a mountain. Death is lighter than a feather. That belief gave Japanese units a psychological edge in close combat. They advanced through fire that would have made other armies falter. They accepted death as routine. Their officers, often leading from the front, expected total devotion, and got it. Yet courage alone could not overcome the machine gun. At Alligator Creek, those same men who had charged through fields in China and the Philippines now faced a sound they could neither outrun nor silence: the endless rattle of Browning fire. Some dove to the ground, trying to crawl forward. Others attempted to use the bodies of fallen comrades as cover. But every movement drew a new burst. Survivors described the confusion, how orders disappeared under the noise, how the air was filled not just with bullets, but with disbelief. It wasn't that the Americans had better morale. It was that their fire did not end. The Japanese infantryman, conditioned to seize fleeting moments of pause, found none. That night broke something deeper than a formation. It broke a certainty, the faith that bravery could always close the distance. From a tactical standpoint, the American defense at Alligator Creek was a masterpiece of preparation. The Marines had transformed a strip of muddy jungle into a fortress of invisible geometry. Arcs, fields, and intersecting zones of fire that covered every likely avenue of approach. Each gun crew knew its assigned range, its backup sector, and its emergency firing plan. Behind each Browning M1917 was a crew of 5. The gunner, the assistant gunner, 2 ammunition handlers, and a spotter. They worked in rhythm. One fed the belts, another kept the water levels steady, while others replaced hot barrels or relayed new ammunition from the rear. This coordination turned the machine gun into more than a weapon. It became part of a living organism, the defensive system itself. As the Japanese advanced, they were caught in this network of overlapping fire. No single gun needed to hold the line alone. Each one reinforced its neighbors. When a crew paused to reload, another position took over. The result was the illusion of continuous, unbroken fire, as if an entire wall of metal had been unleashed. Marine training had emphasized precisely this: to deny the enemy movement, to make the battlefield itself uninhabitable. In the Pacific jungles, visibility was short, but fields of fire were mapped through instinct and repetition. Marines could recite their sectors even in pitch darkness. Colonel Ichiki's men, attacking with courage but little reconnaissance, charged into that unseen structure. The creek bed they used as a pathway became a natural kill zone, flanked by machine guns positioned for crossfire. As flares lit the night, the terrain's secret geometry revealed itself in streams of tracer rounds crisscrossing the black. It was not heroism that won the battle. It was mathematics, and for every Japanese soldier who reached the wire, hundreds never crossed the open ground. The Browning M1917A1 had been perfected over decades of industrial refinement. At its heart was a principle simple but revolutionary. Mechanical endurance could outlast human endurance. With a 250-round belt and a cooling system capable of maintaining temperature through thousands of rounds, the gun turned warfare into sustained pressure. Each M1917 could fire at a rate of 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Crews often linked multiple belts, feeding them seamlessly through the receiver. If the water boiled away, gunners poured in more, even urine, in desperate moments. The gun's recoil-operated action, forged from milled steel, rarely jammed even in jungle humidity. The Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun, though formidable, was fewer in number and less suited to tropical conditions. It used oil cooling and had a slower rate of fire, around 450 rounds per minute, but its 30-round strip feed limited endurance. The difference was devastating in prolonged engagements. For the Marines, technology was not just about killing, it was about control. Continuous fire allowed them to dictate tempo. Every burst, every belt, was part of a calculated rhythm designed to smother the enemy's initiative. To the Japanese, this seemed almost unnatural. War had always been human, the clash of will and skill. But now, machines carried that burden, their unending voices replacing the cries of men. That psychological dissonance between spirit and steel defined the Pacific War. When the Japanese first reported on the battle, they described the American defense as unearthly, a wall of fire that seemed to flow without limit. It was not an exaggeration. At Alligator Creek, more than 770 Japanese soldiers were killed in a few hours. American losses were fewer than 50. The imbalance was not of bravery, but of mechanics. The industrial precision that powered those water-cooled Brownings through the night. By dawn, when the gun barrels cooled and the smoke settled, the beach was silent except for the lapping of the tide against spent casings. The Marines had proven that endurance in war had been redefined, not by muscle or courage, but by engineering and supply. But beneath the calm, something deeper stirred. A question of how far machinery could go in replacing man himself. Colonel Ichiki was not reckless. He was a veteran of the China campaigns, a man who had witnessed battle and believed in decisive action. But he was also a product of a military philosophy that no longer fit the war he faced. His superiors in Tokyo had ordered him to retake Guadalcanal swiftly, a task he accepted with confidence. Reports underestimated the enemy, suggesting a few hundred Marines at most. When he landed east of the marine perimeter with nearly 900 men, Ichiki saw speed as his ally. He rejected requests to wait for reinforcements, insisting that hesitation was weakness. His troops would strike immediately, overwhelm the beachhead, and seize back the airfield before dawn. But Ichiki had misjudged the new reality of firepower. The Americans were not a scattered garrison. They were dug in, well supplied, and operating under a doctrine that valued sustained fire and mutual support. When his men charged, the colonel watched their formations vanish into smoke and gunfire. Even then, he believed courage might turn the tide. He sent wave after wave forward, expecting that somewhere the Marines would falter. None did. The guns did not stop. By morning, nearly his entire detachment was dead. Ichiki, facing dishonor, reportedly committed suicide near the shoreline. His tragedy mirrored the Japanese command's wider struggle. For all their tactical brilliance, they had entered a war shaped by industrial modernity, a war in which bravery could not counterbalance a machine that never tired. The machine gun had done more than destroy a battalion. It had humbled a doctrine. Long after the battle ended, survivors spoke not of what they saw, but what they heard. The sound of Browning machine guns became a recurring nightmare, a deep, vibrating rhythm that marked the boundary between courage and futility. Psychologists studying post-war testimonies noted that Japanese veterans of Guadalcanal used the same phrase repeatedly: "It never stopped." That sentence captured the terror of facing an enemy whose fire seemed eternal, as if the jungle itself had turned against them. For the Japanese soldier, trained to exploit moments of weakness, the absence of pause was disorienting. Every instinct told him to rush when the gun went silent, but the gun never did. Even the darkness, which usually protected movement, offered no safety. Tracer rounds stitched through trees, cutting down silhouettes before they reached the wire. To the Americans, the effect was equally profound, but opposite. The sound of their own guns brought reassurance. It was rhythm, stability, survival. Machine gun crews learned to read battle through sound. When to feed another belt, when to adjust fire. They could sense the battlefield through vibration, through the metallic pulse that echoed in their bones. When dawn came and the silence returned, Marines often described an eerie stillness, a realization that the noise had become part of them. Some would later say that after the war, it was the quiet that haunted them more than the sound. That night, both sides experienced the birth of a new psychology of warfare, the realization that machines could dominate human senses, even emotions. The Japanese infantryman lost his certainty and courage. The American gunner lost his innocence in control. Every weapon transforms the man who wields it, and the one it destroys. The endless fire that defined Alligator Creek was not only a triumph of engineering, it was also a moral threshold. For centuries, warriors had seen battle as a contest of skill, courage, or divine will. A man faced another man. Even in death, there was recognition. But machine guns changed that relationship. At Guadalcanal, Marines behind their Brownings could not see faces, only shapes in the dark. Their job was not to fight individuals, but to maintain pressure, to keep the weapon alive. Each gun crew worked like a factory assembly line. The process was impersonal, mechanical: feeding, cooling, clearing, firing. The line between defense and destruction blurred. And yet, when daylight revealed the field before them, strewn with bodies in the stillness of dawn, the human cost returned in full. Marines who had fired all night walked among hundreds of fallen Japanese soldiers. Some were barely older than boys. Many carried photographs, flags inscribed with the names of families who had sent them off to war. There was no cheering, only silence and a strange sense of disbelief that so few men, hidden behind guns and sandbags, could bring about such devastation. For the Japanese, that same scene marked the loss of a moral anchor. The Banzai spirit, The conviction that bravery could transcend bullets had met its limit. Yet rather than abandoning it, Japan's leadership clung to it even more tightly, believing that spirit alone might somehow restore balance against America's machines. The Pacific War would continue with that contradiction at its heart. One side fighting through willpower, the other through machinery, each believing their way represented the truest form of human strength. At Alligator Creek, those two worlds met, and in the roar of endless fire, both were forever changed. When the smoke cleared, Guadalcanal was no longer just a battlefield. It was a mirror, showing each army what the future of war truly looked like. And that realization leads directly to the story's climax, when the endless guns turned the tide of the entire campaign, forcing both sides to confront the full scale of industrial warfare in the Pacific. Alligator Creek, Guadalcanal, 0130 hours, August 21st, 1942. The jungle was alive with sound. The rain had stopped, but mist clung low to the ground, rolling like breath over the damp earth. For hours, the Marines had waited, listening, watching, feeling the pulse of the night around them. They knew the Japanese were out there. Then it began. The first flare rose skyward, a red blossom against the black canopy. And for a brief moment, the world turned to daylight. In that frozen instant, the Marines saw movement. Hundreds of figures emerging from the tree line, bayonets glinting, boots splashing through the shallow creek. And then the guns spoke. The Browning M1917A1s thundered, as if one machine had awoken. The steady rhythm, 600 rounds a minute, water boiling in the jackets, steam hissing, turned into a continuous wall of fire. Gunners shouted over the din, feeding belts into the receivers, replacing barrels when they began to glow red. Shell casings clinked and hissed as they hit the wet soil, piling into small golden mounds around the guns. The Japanese kept coming. Their officers, swords raised, urged them forward, shouting orders drowned by the roar. For a moment, the front ranks seemed unstoppable, shadows surging through the tracer-lit night. But every few yards, men fell. The Brownings did not pause. Interlocking fields of fire cut across the creek bed, and Marines along the line joined in with rifles and bars, adding to the metallic thunder. For the Japanese infantry, it was a nightmare without rhythm. They had been trained to charge during reloads, to find the moment when the enemy's fire weakened. But these guns had no rhythm, no pause. Only a single, endless scream. One Marine remembered, "We didn't fire in bursts that night. We just fired, steady, nonstop. They kept coming, and the guns kept talking." The first wave disintegrated in minutes. The second tried to cross farther upstream, where the river split into shallow forks. But there, too, hidden behind the thick brush, Marine gunners opened up. The bullets tore through palm leaves and bodies alike, turning the darkness into a vibrating curtain of tracers. Some Japanese soldiers crawled forward, dragging wounded comrades, using the terrain to approach within grenade range. They hurled explosives into the Marine lines, brief flashes of white light that blew holes in the earth but failed to break the defense. Each time a gun fell silent, another nearby position took up the rhythm. The sound never truly stopped. By 0300 hours, the battlefield had become a landscape of flashes and echo. Marines shouted for more ammunition. Runners dashed through the mud carrying belts across the line. Water boiled away from gun jackets, replaced hastily with whatever liquid the crews could find. One unit poured in coffee from their canteens. Another, according to accounts, even used urine to keep barrels cool. The guns did not care. They simply fired. When the Japanese finally broke contact, the creek bed was a scene of devastation. Hundreds of bodies lay motionless among shattered trees and burning undergrowth. But Ichiki, unwilling to believe the battle was lost, ordered another assault before dawn, a final, desperate charge to restore honor and complete his mission. At 04:30 hours, the flares went up again. Once more, the jungle turned white with light. Once more, the Browning guns came alive. The final charge lasted barely 15 minutes. It was a wave consumed by fire, a wall of humanity colliding with the relentless precision of industry. Some reached the barbed wire, hacking at it with bayonets before being cut down. Others fell in silence, smoke rising from the soil around them. When the firing stopped at last, the silence felt unnatural. Marines stood slowly, their ears ringing, faces streaked with soot. In the faint light of dawn, the battlefield appeared unreal, a carpet of fallen men stretching to the tree line. The numbers told the story. Of the 917 men in Ichiki's detachment, more than 770 were killed. Barely a handful returned to Japanese lines. American casualties totaled fewer than 50. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors that morning. Then, surrounded by the remains of his command, he took his own life. The Battle of the Tenaru River, as it became known, was the first major land victory for the U.S. Marines in the Pacific War. It proved that the Japanese infantry, so formidable in spirit, could be defeated through fire discipline, logistics, and endurance. But more importantly, it revealed a new truth to both sides, that industrial warfare had reached the islands, and no amount of valor could silence a weapon designed to never stop firing. As reports reached Tokyo, shock spread through the Imperial Army's high command. They had underestimated the Americans, not in courage, but in capacity. They began to grasp that the war ahead would not be decided by who charged hardest, but by who could feed the guns longest. For the Americans, Guadalcanal became a crucible, a test of supply lines, nerves, and the limits of endurance. The night at Alligator Creek was only the beginning. The island would soon erupt again in battles that would stretch both armies to breaking point. And in that relentless campaign, the endless guns would once again decide who lived and who vanished into the jungle. Dawn, August 24, 1942. The sun rose slowly over Guadalcanal, its light creeping across a landscape that looked like the aftermath of a storm made of steel. Smoke still drifted from the palm groves, the stench of cordite mixed with the sweet rot of the jungle. The Marines walked among the fallen, rifles slung low, faces gray with fatigue. For the first time since landing, they had seen what their weapons could truly do. There was no cheering, just silence, broken by the hiss of cooling barrels and the distant hum of insects returning to life. They called it Hell Creek now. Word spread quickly through the American lines how a few dozen men, with discipline and machine guns, had stopped a regiment cold. It became a lesson taught in real time. The power of logistics, coordination, and industrial might over reckless courage. General Alexander Vandegrift visited the position later that morning. He looked across the charred ground and quietly ordered his staff to dig in deeper. He knew this was only the first test. The Japanese would not leave Guadalcanal easily, and indeed, they did not. In Tokyo, the reports stunned the general staff. The loss of Ichiki's detachment, a veteran unit once held in high regard, was inconceivable. It was the first undeniable sign that the American Marines, dismissed as amateurs, could not only fight, but win. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, ordered immediate reinforcements. By late August, new landings began. The 35th Infantry Brigade, followed by the Kawaguchi Detachment. Their mission was clear: destroy the American foothold before it could become a fortress. The campaign turned into a war of attrition unlike anything Japan had faced before. Each attempt to retake Henderson Field, the vital airstrip, was met with the same unrelenting defense. Machine gun nests, interlocking arcs of fire, and night patrols guarding every approach. The Japanese soldiers, brave and relentless, advanced through the jungle shouting, "Banzai!" but met the same mechanical answer. The metallic thunder of the Brownings and the deep bark of the 37mm guns. The more they charged, the more they fed the lesson Ichiki had learned too late. At Edson's Ridge in September, the pattern repeated. Japanese units attacked in waves through the night, guided by flares and shouted commands. The Marines, outnumbered and exhausted, fought from foxholes and sandbag bunkers, once again relying on their machine guns to hold back the storm. For hours, the slope burned with tracer fire. When dawn came, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay on the hillside, their courage unquestioned but their tactics doomed. Meanwhile, in the dugouts around Henderson Field, a new confidence grew among the Marines. They began to understand the rhythm of this new kind of war. It wasn't about heroics in the open. It was about preparation, endurance, and the ability to sustain fire when the enemy expected silence. Machine gun crews became legends. Some of the names are still remembered in Marine lore. The gunners who fired so long their barrels melted, who fought until their belts ran dry, who poured every ounce of will into keeping the guns alive. As the campaign dragged on, both sides paid an unbearable cost. The Japanese, forced to supply their troops at night through narrow channels, the infamous Tokyo Express, lost destroyers and men to American naval power. Starvation crept through their lines. The once proud regiments that had conquered half of Asia were now reduced to scattered, hungry survivors. On the American side, disease, exhaustion, and jungle rot gnawed at the men. But they held. The endless guns at Tenaru and Edson's Ridge had bought them time. Time for reinforcements, for supplies, for the balance of the Pacific to shift. By early 1943, the Japanese High Command made the decision they had sworn never to make. They ordered an evacuation of Guadalcanal. What had begun as a bold offensive had turned into a slow, grinding retreat. In the final nights of withdrawal, small groups of Japanese soldiers slipped through the jungle toward the coast. Some looked back toward Henderson Field, where the glare of American flares still marked the night sky. For many, it was not just the loss of an island. It was the loss of a belief, the faith that spiritual strength and discipline alone could overcome an enemy driven by machines. The endless fire of Guadalcanal had broken more than a regiment. It had broken an illusion. After Ichiki's defeat, the Imperial Army began to adapt, building more firepower into their units, attempting to modernize supply and tactics. But it was too late. The Pacific was already turning into a battlefield of endurance, where factories, fuel, and logistics mattered more than valor. Guadalcanal became the pivot, the place where the tide began to flow the other way. From there, every Japanese retreat traced its roots back to that night at Alligator Creek, where courage met mechanized will and was drowned in sound. For the Marines, the victory carried a quiet lesson too. They learned that victory did not come cheaply, that every round fired meant hours of carrying belts through the mud. That endurance was the new measure of strength. In later campaigns, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, they would remember the lesson born here, that the gun must never go silent. That fire superiority was not just a tactic, but survival itself. As Guadalcanal fell silent in February 1943, only the sea carried the echo of that endless night. The wind moved through the palms like a whisper of machine gun fire, fading into memory. The war was far from over, but its direction had changed. The Japanese infantry, once the spearhead of empire, had met the future of warfare and been consumed by it. And somewhere on the scarred banks of Alligator Creek, the ground still bore the marks of the tripods, silent monuments to the night when machine guns fired endlessly. In the days following the battle, the Marines buried the fallen under the sweltering Solomon sun. The jungle had gone quiet again, save for the low hum of flies and the steady drone of engines from Henderson Field. For the men on the ground, the victory at the Tenaru River felt both decisive and hollow. They had survived, but the faces of the dead lingered in their minds, American and Japanese alike. Young men caught between old doctrines and a new kind of war. News of the victory reached the American home front within days. Newspapers described the Marines' stand in glowing terms, the first American ground victory of the Pacific War. But within the military, there was less celebration and more calculation. Guadalcanal had revealed just how fragile the American position remained. The Marines were still outnumbered, undersupplied, and exposed to nightly bombardments from Japanese ships and aircraft. General Vandegrift's message to headquarters in Noumea was cautious. "We can hold, if we are reinforced." The Tenaru had proved that courage and firepower could stop a Japanese regiment. But it also showed how thin the line was. The Marines had fired nearly every round they had, consuming ammunition faster than supply ships could deliver it. In the coming months, the defense of Henderson Field would depend not only on bravery, but on the slow, grinding machinery of American logistics, ships, fuel, and factories thousands of miles away. In Japan, the reaction was shock and disbelief. The loss of Ichiki's detachment, and the manner of it, struck at the heart of Imperial Army pride. These were not conscripts. They were among Japan's most disciplined and experienced infantry. Their annihilation by what Tokyo had dismissed as a weak and inexperienced enemy demanded an explanation. The initial reports were softened for public consumption. The Army described the battle as a tactical setback, blaming local terrain and communications. But within the high command, the truth was known. Ichiki's overconfidence and the failure to coordinate with naval support had led to disaster. Colonel Ichiki was posthumously promoted, his final act framed as one of self-sacrifice. Yet among staff officers, his name became a warning, a symbol of arrogance and underestimation. The Imperial General Staff soon ordered a major inquiry into future operations. Plans were redrawn. New reinforcements under General Kawaguchi were dispatched to Guadalcanal, tasked with avenging Ichiki's defeat and retaking Henderson Field. But the momentum had shifted. The Americans now held the high ground, both literally and psychologically. For the first time in the Pacific War, the myth of Japanese invincibility was cracked. The Marines' victory at Tenaru proved that the Imperial Army could be stopped. That machine gun fire, properly coordinated, could destroy even the most determined human assault. This revelation spread through the Allied ranks like fire. The Army and Navy, previously cautious in confronting Japan head-on, began to see the Pacific as winnable. Commanders studied the Tenaru battle reports in detail, noting how interlocking fields of fire and disciplined ammunition management had made the difference. In training camps across the United States, instructors began emphasizing defensive fire coordination and night fighting techniques, drawing lessons straight from the Guadalcanal experience. Meanwhile, American industry responded with renewed urgency. The weapon that had broken Ichiki's assault, the Browning M1917 and its lighter cousin, the M1919, was now prioritized for production. Thousands would be shipped to the Pacific, destined for beaches and jungles that had not yet been fought over. Yet even in victory, there was unease. The Marines had seen the courage of the men they faced, men who charged machine guns without hesitation, who fought to the last even when surrounded. That realization haunted many of them. They knew that this was only the first of many battles, and that the enemy's will to fight was far from broken. In letters home, one Marine wrote simply, "If this is what the first fight looks like, I don't want to see the last." Guadalcanal was not yet secure. The Japanese would return at Edson's Ridge, at the Matanikau River, and at the Bloody Ridge. The endless fire at Tenaru was only the prologue to a campaign that would consume thousands more lives before the island was finally declared secure 6 months later. The battle had ended, but the war on Guadalcanal had only just begun. By early 1943, Guadalcanal was no longer just an island. It was a symbol. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan had been stopped and forced to retreat. The imperial flag that had advanced across the Pacific, from Hong Kong to Singapore, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, had met a line it could not cross. The battle's outcome forced Tokyo to reevaluate its grand strategy. What had been envisioned as a swift, expanding perimeter of dominance now became a defensive struggle. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Japan's war effort, was exhausted. Months of continuous combat around Guadalcanal had cost it dozens of ships and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. In the aftermath, Japan's naval leadership made a painful admission. They could not sustain a war of attrition against the United States. The resources, fuel, and manpower simply did not exist, yet retreat did not come easily. The Japanese army refused to concede failure. Soldiers trapped on Guadalcanal continued to fight in small pockets until the final evacuation in February 1943, an operation conducted under the cover of darkness, known as Operation K. Roughly 10,000 men were pulled off the island in secrecy, leaving behind a graveyard of comrades who would never return home. To the Americans, this silent withdrawal marked a victory greater than any headline could convey. It meant the momentum of the Pacific War had shifted, permanently. For the United States, Guadalcanal became a proving ground for everything that would follow. It tested the logistics of amphibious warfare, the coordination of air, sea, and ground forces, and the psychological endurance of soldiers who fought in conditions as hostile as the enemy itself. The lessons learned here shaped every operation that came after. Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At every one of those places, the sound of the machine gun remained the same. The steady, metallic heartbeat of a new age of warfare. Strategically, the victory allowed the Allies to secure the Solomon Islands, opening the path for Operation Cartwheel. General MacArthur's plan to bypass and isolate Japan's fortified strongholds in the South Pacific. From there, the Allies could move northward toward Rabaul, then the Philippines, and eventually the Japanese home islands. Each step of that long advance began with Guadalcanal. The psychological impact was even deeper. In 1942, many in Washington had feared that Japan's early victories meant the Pacific might take years to recover. Guadalcanal shattered that fear. It proved that the Imperial Army, once thought unstoppable, could be broken through training, discipline, and sustained firepower. For American soldiers, Guadalcanal became a quiet source of pride. Not a place of triumph, but of survival. Veterans of that campaign would later say it was where the myth of the Marine Corps' invincibility was born. Not because they were fearless, but because they endured what no one else had endured before. For the Japanese, the defeat carried a wound that never fully healed. The loss of Ichiki's detachment and the failure to retake the island dealt a blow to morale across the entire military. The belief in the superiority of the Japanese fighting spirit, the idea that discipline and courage could overcome material disadvantage, began to crumble. From this point forward, Japanese strategy grew increasingly desperate, marked by riskier operations, overextended defenses, and eventually, the rise of suicidal tactics, the kamikaze, the final echo of a fading doctrine. In the larger picture, Guadalcanal marked a hinge in history. It was the moment when industrial might proved itself the deciding factor in modern warfare. No longer could courage alone carry an army forward. The side that could feed its guns, ship after ship, crate after crate, belt after belt, would win. It also changed how wars were fought. Commanders now studied logistics as carefully as tactics. The endless guns at Tenaru were not just weapons, they were symbols of a new truth. That control of production, transport, and supply lines would define victory in the 20th century. When the last shots on Guadalcanal faded, and the Marines finally raised the stars and stripes over the battered airfield, they did not cheer loudly. They stood quietly, exhausted, and hollow-eyed. They knew what the victory had cost, but they also knew what it meant. The Japanese infantry, once feared across Asia, had met a force it could not outmatch, not in spirit, but in endurance. And from that moment onward, the balance of the Pacific tilted toward the United States. The war had years left to burn, but its direction had changed forever. The machine guns that fired endlessly at Alligator Creek had not only stopped an attack, they had begun a new chapter of history. The Battle of Guadalcanal ended not with fanfare, but with silence. The jungle reclaimed the scars of battle quickly. Vines grew over shell holes, grass hid the rusting tripods of machine guns, and the river once again ran clear. Yet beneath that soil lay the story of a transformation, the moment when war itself changed shape. For the men who fought there, it was never about glory. It was about holding a line in the dark, about feeding ammunition into barrels that glowed red, about staying awake when exhaustion made the world blur. They were young, frightened, and far from home. But in that fear, they found endurance. For the Japanese infantry, Guadalcanal marked the death of a belief. The idea that courage alone could overcome modern war. They fought with devotion that history still remembers, but they faced something they had not been trained to understand. A war run by machines, factories, and fuel. And for the world watching, Guadalcanal offered a brutal truth. The age of industrial warfare had arrived in full. The outcome of battles would no longer be decided by single charges or heroic stands, but by logistics, persistence, and the capacity to sustain fire when everything else failed. Yet, even within that mechanized horror, humanity endured. The soldiers on both sides, drenched in rain, surrounded by death, still shared the same moments of fear, faith, and fatigue. In their letters and memories, they wrote not about conquest, but about survival, comradeship, and the strange quiet that follows battle. When historians speak of turning points, they speak of maps and strategies. But Guadalcanal's real turning point was human. The moment when endurance became the new form of courage. The machine guns that fired endlessly across Alligator Creek did more than stop an assault. They announced the beginning of a new kind of war, one that would shape the century and remind every generation after that courage alone must now stand beside endurance, discipline, and will. And long after the jungle swallowed the last echoes of gunfire, that lesson remained. If stories like this remind you how ordinary men shaped extraordinary moments in history, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Which side of Guadalcanal's story moved you the most?